you have this picture of how it is that a brain generates this experience of being a self, and you write about selfhood and the way that it's not that you are a self and that there's some kind of objective essence that persists over time, right? But more that the self is a perception. And do you think this lends credence to the idea that in meditative and psychedelic states, when people have the insight that the self is an illusion, that is actually something supported by science?
I would say it's consistent. I'm not sure to what degree there's actual support there, but anything that reveals in the first person the constructed nature of selfhood, I think, is compatible with this notion that the self is a kind of perception. And it's not just in meditation. It's there are psychedelics, again, gives you a state where you can understand the self as quite you have these ego dissolution experiences where the self dissolves in some ways, but not in all ways. And then, of course, there's a whole raft of different kinds of neurological and psychiatric conditions where experiences of selfhood are altered in quite specific ways. And there's no way to understand all of these things in terms of there being some unitary essence of self. But they do all make sense if you think of the experience of self as a kind of perception, but the sort of perception that's made up of many different things going on at once. So the perception of, back to what we were talking about, the perception of the control-oriented perception of the physiological condition of the body, all the way up to the perception of my social environment and cultural environment. And then in the middle, things like perception of internally driven actions, which I associate with free will and agency, and the experience of having a first-person perspective on the world. All of these sorts of things together construct the normal, everyday experience of being a human self. But we will experience it differently too.
Right. And so with this picture, we're talking about, it's very much a neuroscience picture, right? We're talking about the brain and human experience because that's what we can study. What are your intuitions as to where consciousness exists in amongst kind of, in the rest of nature? Is it fully dependent on the nervous system? If an animal doesn't have a nervous system, do you think it's impossible for it to have consciousness?
I don't know for sure, but I doubt it. And there's just inevitable uncertainty here because we just lack a consensus marker of consciousness. So all we can do is reasonably extrapolate from what we take as sufficient mechanisms in humans and, at least for me, mammals. So I think mammals share all the necessary neural equipment to be pretty sure they have conscious states too. This may seem trivial, but of course it's not a trivial thing to say. There are people throughout history who have required that there be a certain level of intelligence or linguistic competence or explicit self-awareness to attribute consciousness to a creature. I think those are all the wrong sorts of criteria. They all stem from a kind of anthropocentrism that we still have, a latent anthropocentrism where we sort of take that which we think of as most distinctive of humans and take that as a sort of basic criteria for something that's take that as a criteria for something that is actually much more basic, which might be the ability to have conscious experiences at all. So the way I tend to think of this is that, yes, all mammals have this necessary equipment for consciousness. Beyond that, it becomes very interesting and largely unknown. You look at, and probably quite varied. I mean, then it becomes like you treat birds as a single problem, but of course there are many different types of birds. Fish, there are many different types of fish. Octopuses, there are many different types of cephalopod. We are always caught between the challenge of knowing that intelligence is not the same thing as consciousness, but nonetheless being tempted to use intelligent behavior as some kind of yardstick by which to attribute consciousness. I think, in a sense, it's informative, but we must always be careful not to equate the two. So I do think you need a nervous system to be conscious. And I don't think any kind of nervous system is sufficient for consciousness either. But exactly where you draw the line is a story that's yet to be told. But where I think this idea of tying consciousness more closely to life takes us is that the circle of species that have conscious experiences may be broader than if you thought about consciousness as some kind of elaborate cognitive competence.
Right. And with that sense of kind of cognitive competence, I guess that takes us to the idea of conscious machines, right? Because we've got artificial intelligence, but given that you have this very embodied view of consciousness, the other extreme would be a kind of functionalist view where it's all to do with information processing, right? And it's fully substrate independent, and you could just instantiate a mind in a simulation. Do you align more with the idea that it wouldn't be possible to do that?
So yeah, this is where the book lands in the end, with a discussion of these fairly topical issues about machine consciousness, and topical not in the sense that I think there's any likelihood that we'll be living among them in the next couple of years, but because there's quite a lot of attention to the development of AI at the moment. And part of this attention in AI is justified, part of it maybe a little bit overhyped. But there is an interesting question there. We can build machines that do smart things now. Will it ever be reasonable to attribute them with conscious states? Now, some people think that consciousness is a sort of function of intelligence and it's substrate independent. So if a machine is made out of silicon, once it crosses some threshold of intelligence, the lights come on, the inner lights come on, and it has experiences. I think there are, as I explain in the book, there are very many problems with that argument. It's kind of interesting why people have that intuition. Not everybody has it, but some people do. The main issue, the unknown issue about consciousness in this context is indeed whether it's something a machine, however sophisticated, could ever have. Is it something that is substrate independent? In a sense, we are machines too, but what I'm getting at is, does the stuff we're made out of matter? Or could we be a silicon beast machine and be conscious? Again, it's sort of impossible to know for sure. I just find some of the assumptions people make in this area as quite unsafe. So there's this idea that consciousness is a form of information processing. This seems to be a statement that people make and just think it's perfectly obvious that that's true. It's just a question of what form of information processing. I don't think this is a safe assumption at all. And of course, I'm not alone in this. There are many others who are skeptical of this idea, that it's just not obvious that information processing is sufficient for consciousness. It's sufficient for cognition, it's sufficient for intelligence, but is it sufficient for raw feeling? Now, the connection that I've tied to life suggests that it might not be. That when you think about the brain's role in regulating the body, there's no sharp distinction between mindware and wetware here. This imperative for self-regulation goes all the way down. So it's not a question of running the right program on the wetware of the brain and that's how consciousness happens. No, it's sort of deeply embedded in the physiology of the system. So I don't think it's a safe assumption that a conscious machine is simply going to happen as AI improves. But I also don't think it's safe to assume that it won't. And here's where it gets tricky. Because constructing a conscious machine is not something that we should be trying to do, I don't think. Certainly not something we should be blindly pursuing. Because if we could generate synthetic consciousness, then we have suddenly introduced things that are moral subjects into the world. We have to care about them. If there's potentially the capacity for artificial suffering, this could be a massive ethical catastrophe. So just setting out to build a conscious machine is like, well, why would you do that? That's not a great thing to aim at without very, very good reason. So even though I think it's really unlikely, the inability to exclude it means that we should pay attention to the ramifications of either deliberately or accidentally succeeding.